I lay at the bottom of the stairs, pain crushing my chest, barely able to breathe, while my mother-in-law said, "Please don't make a scene. Think about his future." That was the moment I realised, in this family, my pain was the only thing that wasn't allowed to exist. I didn't scream. Not even when the edge of a stair had driven itself against my ribs, making each breath sharp and fast and shallow. Not when I tried to move and felt a pressure like something inside me had cracked. I didn't scream because I knew it wouldn't change anything, and I knew who'd get blamed. The house was quiet except for the slow, deliberate footsteps above Greg, pacing like he always did when things didn't go his way. Then came the bedroom door slamming shut. I flinched at the sound even though I shouldn't have. It wasn't new. Nothing about that night was. Except maybe the fact that I couldn't get up. She appeared before he did. His mother. Always the first to assess the damage, always the one to patch the story before anyone else could. Her heels clicked down the steps, carefully controlled neat like she had done this before. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't look scared. She just knelt down next to me and leaned in close so no one could hear. "Clara," she said quietly, "this isn't the time to make a big deal. You must have missed a step. Just say that." I tried to sit up and pain shot through my side like fire. "He pushed me," I said, the words dry-cracked. She froze for a second, just a flicker, then composed herself. "You're confused," she said. "You slipped. That's what we'll tell them." I looked up at her. Her makeup was flawless, her lips lined in perfect rows. Her expression didn't change. "He has a future. You don't want to ruin that over this, do you?" I didn't answer, not because I agreed, but because the truth was sinking in. My pain wasn't just inconvenient to them, it was unwelcome. She stood up, brushed imaginary lint from her skirt and called for an ambulance, calmly, like she was reporting a parking ticket. At the hospital, I said what I was told to say. I'd slipped. The stairs were slick. I must have been tired. No, it wasn't the first time I'd fallen. Yes, I was clumsy. The nurse didn't argue. She asked the questions gently and cleaned the blood near my hairline. Said I probably had some cracked ribs. Told me to breathe slowly. I followed instructions. I always did. Greg didn't come in with me. He said he'd park the car. Then he texted that he needed to check on the kids. He never came back inside. His mother waited in the hallway with a scarf around her shoulders like she was cold. The staff didn't ask much more after that. No one wanted trouble. After a while, a different nurse came in. Older, slower, kinder. She checked my vitals, looked at my bruised arm and asked if the pain was worse when I breathed in or out. "Both," I said. She nodded, didn't press. As she turned to go, she reached into her pocket and left a small card on the table next to me. "If you ever need to talk," she said, "just that." Then she walked out. I stared at the card for a while. It was plain. No bright colours. Just a name, a number, and a short line beneath Women's Transitional Support. Available anytime. I didn't touch it until I heard the door creak and Greg stepped in. He was calm now. He always was after. He kissed the top of my head like it was some kind of ritual. "You scared everyone," he said, rubbing my shoulder gently. "They thought you broke something." I didn't reply. He glanced at the tray beside me, didn't seem to notice the card. Or maybe he did and didn't care. He never worried about what I would or wouldn't do. He knew I'd keep quiet. At home, later that night, when the kids were asleep and the kitchen was dark except for the light over the sink, I pulled the card from my purse and set it on the table. I stared at it for a long time. The number was still there. I could dial it. I didn't, but I didn't throw it away either. I slid it back into the little side pocket of my bag, zipped it shut. I told myself I'd sleep. But that was the first night I didn't. Not really. But that was the first night I didn't. Not really. I stared at the ceiling, feeling every bruise bloom under my skin, listening to the steady beeps from the monitor beside me. Greg wasn't there. The nurse said he went home to check on the kids, but I knew better. He didn't like hospitals, especially when the story couldn't be controlled. The pain in my ribs pulsed like a warning light. My mind drifted, not to the fall, but to the first time he ever made me feel small. It wasn't yelling. It was quiet. Years ago, just after our wedding, I'd suggested we take a weekend trip to see my college friend in Seattle. He said, "That part of your life's over now. Why waste money and time on people who don't matter anymore?" I remember laughing, thinking it was a joke. But we didn't go. And I never brought her up again. After that came little things. He didn't like my jeans not flattering. He preferred I wear my hair down more feminine. He'd raise an eyebrow if I ordered something too expensive when we ate out, even though he made most of the money. I quit my job when I got pregnant with Emma. Greg said we didn't need the extra income and babies deserve full-time moms. He wasn't wrong. But over time, I stopped having money of my own. Everything went through his card. Even groceries had to be justified. I told myself this was normal. Marriage meant compromise. But compromise started to feel like silence. When our son Max was born, things got tighter. I mentioned wanting to pick up part-time work, maybe at a bakery nearby. Greg looked at me like I'd just confessed something shameful. "You can't even keep this house in order, and now you want to add a job." I nodded, apologised, folded the idea and buried it somewhere. The worst part was my own mother reinforced it. I remember calling her once early in our marriage crying because Greg had yelled at me for buying a blouse on sale without asking. She said, "You made your bed, Clara. Now lie in it. That's marriage." So I stopped calling. I stopped sharing. Every door that could have opened was already quietly closing. Even my sister Lorna pulled back after I cancelled on her baby shower because Greg needed the car. She said I was being distant. I wanted to tell her everything, but I didn't know how to start. How do you explain that you're not allowed to explain anything? The years blurred together birthdays, PTA meetings, groceries, scraped knees, forced smiles. The house was clean, the kids were loved, and I was invisible. Sometimes I looked at my reflection and barely recognised the woman staring back. She looked quiet, like she was trying not to take up space. The hospital room hummed with early morning light. I turned my head toward the window. No visitors, no calls. The nurse came in to check my vitals. I asked her gently if my husband had said when he'd be back. She gave me a practiced smile and said, "He mentioned needing to handle things at home." I nodded like that made sense, like it wasn't just another sentence he'd thrown over his shoulder on his way out the door. I was alone, and not just in that room. Something inside me finally registered it, the way the world had arranged itself around Greg's version of me, and the way I'd let it. I reached into my bag, unzipped the pocket, and pulled out the card the nurse had given me the night before. I held it between my fingers, stared at the name and number. I didn't call. I didn't throw it away. I just sat there, holding it like it might anchor me to something I hadn't lost yet. The door clicked open again, but it wasn't Greg. It was the nurse. She didn't say much. Just checked my IV, and then, as she turned to leave, said quietly, "If you need someone to talk to when you're ready, I'm here." Then she walked out, leaving the silence behind her. I held onto that silence, It wasn't heavy like before. It was waiting. And for the first time in years, I didn't rush to fill it. I just let it stay. The silence, the stillness, the space where no one was telling me how I should feel. It didn't last long. Greg arrived 2 hours later with a bouquet of flowers and our kids in tow. His voice was warm, just loud enough to be heard by the nurses outside. "There's my girl," he said, leaning over to kiss my forehead. I flinched without meaning to. He didn't comment. Emma handed me a crayon drawing with a big red heart and stick figures holding hands. "Daddy said you got clumsy," she giggled, "but you're okay now." I smiled and told her it was beautiful. Greg was all charm, asking if I needed anything, fluffing my pillow, wiping invisible crumbs off the side table. The nurse came in mid-scene. I caught her glance as she checked the IV line, brief, unreadable, but not indifferent. After they left, Greg stayed behind while his mum took the kids to the cafeteria. The shift was immediate. His jaw tightened as he closed the door. "You told them what happened?" he asked, quiet but sharp. I shook my head. "I said I slipped." He exhaled through his nose. "Good. I don't need people thinking I'm some kind of monster." I didn't answer. My chest still hurt too much to speak freely. He stepped closer. "You need to get discharged tomorrow. I've got work, and your mum can't help with the kids all week." He said it like a logistical fact. I nodded. "Okay." He looked at me like he wanted more than agreement, like he wanted obedience. "And Clara," he added, softer but heavier, "don't make me the bad guy in front of them again. That's not fair to them." I watched him go. The bouquet sat heavy in its vase like a prop in a stage play. The next morning, I went home. The kids cheered when I walked in. The house was spotless. Greg had even baked cookies, or at least unwrapped and arranged them like he had. He made coffee, let me sit, made a point of telling me I needed to rest. He was kind, gentle, attentive, and I hated how much of me wanted to believe it. That night, once the kids were asleep, he stood in the doorway of our bedroom. "Look," he said, "I know it got out of hand, but we're both tired. We've both said things, done things." He used the word, "we like it was a net to pull me back in." "I just want things to be good again," he said. "Don't you?" I nodded, because what else could I do? "Fight leave." "Where with what?" My ribs still hurt when I breathed too deep. He reached over, gently touched my shoulder. "We're a team, Clara." "Right," I said yes quietly and rolled away to sleep. But I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling again. When I heard him snore, I got up, crept into the hallway, pulled my phone from the drawer where he liked it stored. I sat on the floor in the dark, knees pulled to my chest. I found the card, typed in the number. My finger hovered over the green call button. Just one press. That's all it would take. I closed my eyes. I could still feel the fall, the ache in my ribs, the sound of my own breathing. Short, shallow, scared. My thumb pressed lightly enough to make the screen flicker. Then I heard laughter. Down the hallway. A soft thud, followed by Emma's whisper, "Shh. Max, you'll wake them up." Then giggles. I looked at their door, slightly cracked open, the warm light from their night lamp spilling onto the carpet. My hand dropped. I locked the phone, slipped the card back into my robe pocket, and returned to bed. I lay there, eyes open, staring at nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really had been an accident. Maybe he didn't mean to shove. Maybe I lost my balance. He'd said sorry. He made cookies. The kids were happy. Maybe I was the problem. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the quiet thrum of the house. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the space inside that silence. a space I hadn't felt in years. I didn't trust it yet, but I wasn't afraid of it either. The weekend came. Emma got invited to a birthday party, one of her classmates from school. It was at a park, a picnic-style setup, colourful tablecloths and juice boxes, folding chairs in uneven circles. Greg dropped us off, gave me a kiss on the cheek in front of the other mums, like nothing in the world had ever been wrong. "I'll be back in 2 hours." He smiled. I smiled back. Not for him, for the performance. I sat with the other mums listening to them talk about school fundraisers and camping plans. One of them, a woman named Lisa, said something so casually it knocked the air out of me. "I hated being married." She laughed. I didn't realise how much of myself I gave away until I wasn't doing it anymore. I didn't respond, but I stared at her for a long time. She caught my eye and gave a shrug, almost like she understood. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was normal. Simple. A fact, like saying the weather changed. At 2 a.m, when Greg and the kids were asleep, I opened the flour tin and pulled out the small envelope I'd hidden 2 weeks ago, $60. Nothing much, but I folded a few more bills into it. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, from memory. The last time I touched cash without Greg knowing he'd ask me for the receipt, then called me irresponsible. I had bought Emma a colouring set. He said it was wasteful. I pressed the envelope flat and slid it back into the tin, pushing it down beneath the flour like it was contraband. Then I opened my laptop. I typed slowly, "Domestic Violence Shelters, Oregon." The screen loaded a list. Names I didn't know. Women's centres, community lines, anonymous chats. One had a quote at the top, "You are not alone. You are not to blame." I clicked through stories, short blurbs from women with initials only. JSTRAM. Each one was a life cracked open and stitched back. Not all of them had escaped, but all of them had stopped pretending. At some point, I closed the laptop. I couldn't remember when. I must have fallen asleep on the couch because I woke up to Emma nudging me gently. "Mama, I had a bad dream." I sat up, rubbed my eyes. "What happened in the dream?" I asked. She crawled into my lap, still in her pyjamas, her hair a tangle of soft curls. "There was a storm, and you were outside, and I kept yelling for you, but you didn't come back." I held her tighter. She looked up at me. "Mum, are you scared of Daddy?" I froze. I didn't answer, just brushed the hair from her forehead and kissed it. "Let's get you back to bed," I whispered. After I tucked her in, I stood by her door a long time, hand on the knob. I didn't know what scared me more, that she asked or that I couldn't say no. That week, I walked past a community board near the grocery store. There was a flyer pinned between piano lessons and dog walking services. Legal aid clinic, Wednesdays, 5 to 7 p.m. I took a picture of it, then deleted it. Then took it again. I didn't go, but I had the photo. That night, I added $20 more to the envelope. The flour tin was getting hard to close. I didn't care. I wasn't planning to bake anything anytime soon. Except maybe my way out. The next morning, the house felt still, like it was holding its breath. Greg had taken the car, something about a client meeting. I stayed behind, moving through the kitchen like muscle memory. Coffee dishes, floor crumbs. I reached behind the toaster and pulled out Lily's drawing again. I'd almost forgotten she'd slipped it there. Crayon lines, bold colours. She'd drawn me standing in front of a bakery, round windows, pink frosting on cupcakes, a striped awning. Above it, in purple shaky letters, Mommy's place. I pressed my fingers over the little sign she'd drawn in the window open. I pinned it to the fridge using the strawberry magnet she made in preschool. The glitter had faded, but the glue stains were still there. It stayed up for less than 10 minutes. Greg walked in, saw it, didn't say a word. Just pulled it down, crumpled it and tossed it in the trash like it was junk mail. "She doesn't need silly dreams," he said flatly, reaching for the orange juice. I didn't move. It wasn't silly to her. He turned, looked me over. "And it shouldn't be to you either. You need to stop putting things in her head." I waited until he left the room. Then I pulled the drawing back out, carefully peeled it open. A corner had torn right through the window. I taped it and smoothed it again. My hands trembled. The drawing went back on the fridge. I didn't care if he ripped it again. That night, I sat with Lily on the hallway rug. She was brushing her doll's hair with a tiny pink comb. "I liked your picture," I said softly. She didn't look up. "It was you," she said. "You were happy." I forced a smile. "You make me happy." She paused, looked up then. "If you ever open it for real, can I help?" I nodded. "Of course." After she went to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen again, the drawing taped in place behind me. I didn't touch the flour tin. I didn't touch anything. I just stared. The tape line running through the little pink awning felt like a scar. I went to my purse, reached into the side pocket, pulled out the card. It was slightly bent now, the corner softened from how many times I'd held it without dialing. I looked at it, then walked into the bathroom and locked the door. I sat down on the cold tile floor. The silence was different here, tight and echoing. I ran my finger over the name Dana. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what would happen. I just knew something had to change. I typed the number. I hit call. The first ring was low and steady. The second made me think of the kids down the hall, sleeping safe warm. The third, I almost hung up. Then I remembered the sound of paper ripping of a child's voice, asking to help in a place that didn't exist. The fourth ring clicked. Voicemail. "Hi, this is Dana. If you got this card, you're not alone. Leave a number or don't. I'll check back. Be safe." I didn't speak. I couldn't. But I didn't hang up right away either. I just listened to the silence for a few more seconds, holding it like a thread in my hand. Then I ended the call. I didn't delete the number. I didn't put the card away. I just placed it face down on the bathroom sink and sat with it. And for the first time since the fall, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to save me. I'd made contact, not with words, but with choice. I'd opened a door. The next morning, I tucked the card into the inside pocket of my coat and told Greg I needed to pick up cough syrup for Lily. He grunted from behind his coffee mug, barely looking up. The pharmacy was one of the few places I could go alone. But I walked past it. My hands were shaking. I kept one in my coat pocket the whole time, fingers pressed flat against the card like it was a button I might still be too afraid to press. Dana was already at the cafe when I got there. She'd picked the farthest corner booth with her back against the wall. She looked the same as before, practical, calm, grounded in a way that made no room for pity. She didn't say my name or reach across the table, just nodded once as I slid into the seat across from her. I didn't know what I expected. A lecture, a quiz, a question like, "Why did it take you so long?" Instead, she placed a slim folder on the table. Inside was a stapled packet, Women's Transition Support Services. The pages were thin and clean, but they might as well have been made of concrete for how heavy they felt in my hands. There was a list of legal contacts names of shelters, transitional housing programs, mental health hotlines. One page had the title, planning your exit in bold font. I looked up at her, trying to gauge what she wanted me to do with it. She said nothing. She just let me sit with it. Finally, I said, "I'm not ready to leave." Dana didn't flinch. "Okay," she said. Then, gently, "Do you want to be?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the words "Emergency Relocation Grant" printed on the 5th page. After a while, I nodded. "I want to," I said. It sounded ridiculous, but she didn't laugh. She just nodded, like that was a perfectly acceptable place to start. That night, after the kids went to bed and Greg fell asleep in front of the TV, I went into the hall closet and pulled down the old white binder labelled Kids' Birthdays and Grocery Lists. Inside were dog-eared pages of handwritten recipes I hadn't touched in years. Cinnamon rolls, banana bread, lemon scones. I flipped through them like they were photo albums. And then I did something that made my hands sweat. I opened a new tab on my phone and searched Oregon Cottage Food Business License. I filled out the application in tiny steps. It asked for a business name. I just typed Home Kitchen. It asked for a mailing address. I gave my current one, hoping no envelope would ever actually come. I submitted the form and didn't breathe until the confirmation screen loaded. Nothing changed after that. Not right away. Greg didn't notice. He never asked what I was doing on my phone as long as dinner was on time. I kept the confirmation email unread in my inbox marked as important. That was enough. Over the next few weeks, I started baking again. Only at night, only when the house was quiet. I would mix flour and sugar and eggs with my bare hands just to feel something that didn't belong to him. The kitchen became a strange kind of refuge, still full of tension, but mine in those hours. I didn't bake to sell. Not yet. I baked to remember. To remember who I was before I stopped looking in mirrors for too long. Before I learned how to fold myself into small shapes to fit the day. One night, I made scones. Lemon ones, the kind I used to bring to church bake sales when Lily was still in preschool. The smell filled the kitchen, and something swelled in my chest, something too big for fear. I wrapped one in a paper towel and placed it gently in my nightstand drawer. I didn't eat it. I just wanted to know it was there. A week later, Dana texted me. Just 4 words. Read page 6 again. I did. It was the page about what to pack when the time came. Birth certificates, medications, small cash, a backup phone if possible. I didn't have half those things. But I reread it 3 times and I didn't panic. I folded the page and placed it behind the recipe for banana bread. One afternoon, I bought a second-hand set of baking tins from the thrift store and hid them in the garage under the kids' old baby clothes. Greg never touched those boxes. I labelled one donate later. I wasn't planning a full escape yet. I hadn't even set a date, but I was stacking bricks one by one. A license, a binder, a text message, a lemon scone in a drawer. Greg started noticing small things. I stayed up later. I was quieter in the mornings. Once he asked, "What are you so tired from? Just couldn't sleep," I said. He stared for a second too long, then went back to his cereal. That night, I opened my inbox and finally clicked on the license confirmation. It was real. My name was on it. The PDF loaded slowly, but when it did, it felt like proof of something I'd lost years ago: agency. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But I placed my phone gently on the table like it was something fragile. And in a whisper, I barely heard myself say, "It's happening." Not fast, not loud, but it was happening. 3 days later, he found the envelope. It was around 6:30 in the evening. I had just started dinner. The kids were on the floor with their math worksheets. quiet heads down. Greg walked in muddy boots, tracking onto the tile, holding the flour tin in one hand and the envelope in the other. His face wasn't red with rage. It was blank. That was worse. "What's this?" he asked, not loud, not angry, just flat. I swallowed. My hands were wet from washing carrots. I dried them slowly, buying seconds. "For their summer camp," I said. "I've been setting it aside." He looked at the envelope again, then back at me. "You didn't tell me. You've been busy. I didn't want to bother you." He didn't say anything. Just stared. I didn't flinch. Inside, I was ice. He tossed the tin back onto the counter. "Next time, tell me." That night, he didn't touch his dinner. Didn't talk. Just went into the garage and stayed there for hours. I heard metal clanging. At one point, I thought I heard him hit something. I told the kids he was fixing a shelf. After they were asleep, I walked into the kitchen and opened the tin. The envelope was still there, crumpled but not opened. I took it out, counted. Still all there. I added another 40. Then I packed. I didn't do it fast. I moved like someone going through routine folded shirts, rolled socks. I chose only what fit into one bag for each of us. Essentials only. I left behind my wedding album, my old journals, my perfume. I kept a drawing from Ava, the one with us holding hands in front of a bakery. I wrote a note, just a few words. "Don't look. We're gone. We're safe. Please don't follow." At 1:58 a.m, I stood over their beds. I whispered their names. They were groggy, confused. I didn't explain much. "We're going on a drive, just us." "Okay." They nodded. They trusted me. That hurt more than anything. We got into the car. I turned the key with a breath I didn't know I was holding. The driveway lights didn't flicker on. He was still in the garage, maybe asleep. I didn't look. I reversed slowly, like it was any other morning, and then we drove. For the first 10 miles, I didn't speak. The roads were dark, the town behind us was quiet. At one point, Noah asked, "Are we going to Grandma's?" I said no. I said somewhere better, somewhere with muffins. Around 4 a.m, I stopped at a gas station. The kids were asleep. I bought water crackers, coffee. I checked my phone. 1 missed call. Greg. No message. I turned it off. The sun began to rise just as the highway bent and the trees gave way to coastline. The ocean came into view like a secret, stretched wide and grey-blue and endless. I pulled over. We all got out. I let the kids run ahead toward the sand, still in their pajamas. I stood on the edge of the parking lot, wind in my face, keys in my pocket, and watched them run. I didn't cry. Not even then. But my knees felt loose, like if I sat down I wouldn't get back up. We drove the final 20 minutes into the town Dana had mentioned. It looked like a postcard someone forgot to send. Quiet streets, old signs, a diner with chipped paint. And then I saw it. The storefront, empty, a little crooked, but there. Windows, fogged door, slightly ajar. We stopped in front. I didn't get out right away. The kids asked if this was it. I said maybe. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine clicked off. No sound but the wind and the sea. I stepped out, walked up to the door and pushed it open. Inside smelled like dust and salt and something older. There were spiderwebs in the corners. The floors creaked, but the layout was perfect. Open. Sunlight pooled near the windows. I could already see the counter, the trays, the chalkboard menu. The kids followed me in. Ava whispered, "It smells weird." I laughed. "First time in a long time. It smells like it's waiting for us." There were no beds that night, just sleeping bags from the trunk and folded towels for pillows. I let the kids fall asleep near the old fireplace. I stayed up sitting against the counter, staring into the dark. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I wasn't afraid of it. For the first time in years, the unknown felt less dangerous than what I'd left behind. I reached into my bag, found the envelope again. Still there. I put it in the register drawer. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was the sound of the ocean. Steady. Like breath. I woke up to seagulls. Not an alarm clock, not footsteps down the hall, not a voice calling my name. Just the muffled cries of birds outside a single-pane window and the slow, salty breeze pushing through the curtains. I sat up stiffly on the mattress, thin and low to the ground, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then, I remembered the drive, the fog, the blinking vacancy sign, the key that stuck in the door. The silence. Real silence. Not the kind I'd learned to survive, but the kind I could maybe one day live in. The room was part of a transitional housing unit. 2 bedrooms, no frills but clean. My kids were still asleep in the next room, their backpacks piled near the door like they hadn't moved in years. I didn't wake them. I needed the morning to myself. The bakery was just down the block, wedged between a bookstore and a frame repair shop that looked permanently closed. The windows were dusty, half covered by newspaper. The awning sagged and the door groaned like it hadn't been opened in a decade. But when I stepped inside, something shifted. The air was thick with old flour and disuse, but underneath it, faint and real, was the memory of something warm. Not mine, someone else's. But I felt it. The first day was just sweeping. Layers of dust, crumpled receipts, an ancient broom, leaning in the corner like it had been waiting. I didn't touch the oven yet. I just cleaned. I cleaned for hours. I scraped old stickers off the window. I dumped out forgotten boxes of cupcake liners, hardened into clumps. I found a photo tacked to the back of a cupboard. 2 women in aprons laughing with their arms around each other. I left it there. By the 3rd day, I turned on the oven. I didn't even plan to, I just did. It rumbled, then clicked, then hissed. I held my breath until the orange glow came to life inside. Gas. Old, but working. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I brought down a bag of flour from the shelf, measured out 2 cups, and let my hands move the way they used to in quieter times. Before Greg. Before I learned how to make myself small. The dough didn't rise properly. The crust was uneven. But when I opened the door to let out the heat, the smell rolled into the street like a memory someone might recognise. And apparently someone did. The next morning, taped to the outside of the door was a small piece of notebook paper folded once. I opened it slowly. Smells like childhood. I'll take a dozen next time. No name, no return address. Just that. I didn't smile, not exactly, but something inside me loosened. I spent the next week fixing small things. Oil on the hinges, lemon and vinegar to clean the counters. I painted the cupboards a pale yellow I found in a clearance bin at the hardware store. The kids helped me scrub the front step. They didn't ask when we were going back. They didn't say his name. I didn't either. Each night I baked, not for sale, not yet, just to remember. One night it was banana bread. The next scones with frozen blueberries I bought from the corner grocer. Sometimes they burned, sometimes they collapsed, but the smell always found its way to the sidewalk. And more than once I caught people pausing at the window, peering in like they'd stumbled on something they'd lost years ago. The woman from the housing office stopped by on a Wednesday. She looked around, took in the cracked tiles, the chipped paint, the battered register. It has soul, she said. Not a lot of that left these days. When she left, I stood alone in the middle of the room. Brush in hand, the front window scraped clean for the first time. I dipped the tip in white paint and with shaky fingers began to write. The Hearth. Just that. No last name, no branding, no slogan. Just a word that meant warmth and fire and somewhere to return to. A place where nothing had to be perfect, but everything could begin again. I stepped back, breath fogging the glass. The letters weren't even. One sloped a little, but they were mine. And I had written them in daylight in public with my hands and my name, and no permission but my own. That night after dinner, my daughter asked if she could draw a new picture for the window. I nodded. She sat on the floor with markers while I wiped the counter. My son fell asleep with a book in his arms. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. I didn't cry, not then, but I stood by the window a long time, hand resting on the glass. I remembered the envelope in the drawer, still there, still full, still ready, but for the first time I didn't open it. I didn't need to check. The oven ticked softly behind me, cooling down. I reached for my notebook and started sketching a menu. Just 3 items to start. Nothing fancy. And for the first time since leaving, I didn't feel like I was escaping anything. I felt like I was building something. The oven ticked softly behind me, cooling down. I reached for my notebook and started sketching a menu. Just 3 items to start. Nothing fancy. And for the first time since leaving, I didn't feel like I was escaping anything. I felt like I was building something. I opened the bakery doors that Monday morning with no sign, no grand announcement. Just the smell of bread and the sound of waves nearby. The first customer was an older man who walked with a limp and nodded once before ordering a black coffee and a plain roll. He didn't smile, but he came back the next day. Then came a young mother with a stroller. Then a retired school teacher who asked if I carried oat muffins. I didn't, but I made a batch for the next morning. Word travelled quietly. The Hearth, they started calling it even before I painted the name on the glass. People lingered not just to eat, but to breathe, to sit in the calm, especially women. They came in alone, ordered something small, sat for a long time. One would bring her laptop but never type. Another just looked out the window, stirring her tea until it went cold. I didn't ask questions. I refilled mugs. I wiped tables a little slower, stayed within earshot without hovering. One afternoon, I was restocking behind the counter when the bell above the door rang. A woman in her 30s walked in hair pulled into a tight bun, sunglasses she didn't remove. She stood for a moment, then picked the corner seat and quietly asked for chamomile. I brought it over with a warm scone and a napkin. She didn't touch either. "It's peaceful here," she said eventually. Quiet, but not lonely. I nodded. "That's the goal." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the window, then back to me. "He doesn't hit me, not with fists, but I'm always afraid. Even when he's smiling." She wasn't asking for advice. She just needed to say it somewhere. I slipped a card onto her napkin, no words, just emotion. Her eyes didn't move, but her fingers slid over it and tucked it into her purse. She left 5 minutes later. The cup untouched. The scone barely moved. That night, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and sat at one of the corner tables alone. I hadn't thought about the card in weeks. I realised I didn't feel like someone hiding anymore. I felt like someone watching the tide turn quiet but steady. The next day, a new number called my phone. I almost didn't answer, but instinct made me tap accept. took you long enough to crawl out of your hole?" Greg's voice snapped through the line, sharp and clean. I didn't speak. "Do you think this little fantasy will last? I know where you are. You can't just disappear with my kids and pretend you're the good guy." He laughed. "You think selling muffins makes you a saint?" I pressed the record button without a word. "Just let him talk." He went on for nearly 3 minutes. Insults, threats, promises to set things straight. I saved the recording and sent a copy to a folder labelled legal. When I looked up, the bakery was still empty. The air smelled like cinnamon. I went back to work. A few days later, the woman with the sunglasses came back. No glasses this time, no bun either. Her hair hung loose and clean. She ordered the same tea. "He moved out," she said quietly, like it hadn't quite settled in her own body yet. I called the number. I smiled not wide, but full. "Good." She didn't linger this time. She just nodded once and left a $10 bill folded under the mug. As I cleared the table, I realised something simple and terrifying. I had power now. Not loud power, not courtroom power, but the kind that spreads quietly, one scone, one card, one conversation at a time. And I wasn't afraid to use it. That afternoon, I moved the register drawer and taped a printed sheet underneath emergency resources, just in case. By the end of the week, I had regulars. One woman came in every Friday at noon with her toddler. Another, a nurse, brought her book club in on Sundays. Some came just to sit. Some came for the warm air, but all of them stayed. I was restocking napkins near closing when I heard the bell. I turned, expecting the last regular. But it was Greg. He looked thinner than I remembered and meaner. His eyes scanned the room and landed on me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Not yet. "There you are," he said, smiling for the room. "Thought I'd stop by and see the famous hearth everyone keeps talking about." My hands were steady, but I gripped the counter. 2 customers looked up. One, the book club nurse, stood slightly from her stool. Greg stepped closer. "Let's go. We'll talk in the car." "No," I said, quietly, but it carried. "We're not doing this here." "Clara," the smile dropped. "Don't make this ugly." "This is my place," I said. "You don't belong here." My voice trembled, but I didn't step back. "You need to leave." A man near the door reached into his pocket. "You should go," he said evenly. "Now." Greg looked at the faces around him, then back at me. This isn't over, but he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stood still for a long time, breathing through my ribs, waiting for the shaking to stop. I didn't feel victorious. I felt like something important had just shifted again. Quietly, permanently. I reached under the counter and found my phone. I pulled up the recording and labelled it "Call, Threat, Greg." I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew what I would do next. The court wouldn't believe me just because I said so, but I had evidence now. I had voices, and this time they wouldn't only be mine. I didn't open the file right away, just saved it to a folder called October. That's all I named it. No labels, no titles, no emotion. Just a quiet record of what happened. I didn't need to replay the voicemail Greg left either. His voice had been tattooed into the back of my mind for years, with its fake calm, its layered threats, its way of making cruelty sound like concern. "I'll be there soon," he'd said. "You think hiding behind cupcakes and sympathy makes you a real mother? We'll see what the court thinks about all this." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The bakery opened as usual the next morning. I pulled my hair back, tied my apron, and set out the warm trays. It was Friday. Cinnamon scones, a batch of lemon bars, coffee that wasn't fancy but strong. Customers drifted in, mostly women. Some quiet, some chatty, a few regulars who always paid in cash. They asked how I was doing. I said fine. It was true, mostly. The bell over the door jingled around 10. I didn't look up right away. I thought it might be Claire or Jody from the antique store next door. But then I heard his voice. Clara. I turned. He stood in the middle of the shop like he owned it. Same tailored coat, same clean haircut. Like nothing had changed. Like the last year hadn't happened. Greg, I said. My voice didn't break. My hands didn't shake. They just stilled. He smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Place looks quaint. He glanced around, nodding like a critic. Let's talk. He gestured toward the empty table near the window. Just you and me. I'm working, I said. I kept my eyes on him, not blinking. And this isn't your place? He stepped closer. Not touching, not yelling, but his presence changed the air. We need to fix this. You can't keep the kids from me. You think this is healthy? Some little bakery dream while they live without their father. I heard the espresso machine hiss behind me. Jen, a high school senior who helped part-time, had stopped wiping the counter. Customers were watching now. Greg leaned in, lowering his voice. Come home now. I'll make this all go away. No, I said. His jaw tightened. The mask cracked. Don't do this, Clara. You already did, I said. He reached forward too fast, too sudden, and grabbed my wrist. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to shift the energy in the room. Chairs scraped. Someone gasped. I didn't pull back. I didn't flinch. I just looked him in the eye and said, "Let go." He did. Not because he wanted to, but because someone was walking toward him now. A tall man I barely knew, one of the town mechanics. You should leave, he said. Greg looked around. He saw the eyes on him. The phones. One woman had hers up recording, another already dialing. This is harassment, he snapped. She's my wife. No, I said. I'm not. He backed toward the door, lips tight. You'll regret this, he muttered. Then he left. Just like that. The door swung shut behind him, too loud, too final. I didn't move for a few seconds. The room felt tight and buzzing. Jen brought me a glass of water. I took it not to drink, just to hold something solid. A woman approached me later. She looked about my age, hair pulled into a tight bun cardigan, buttoned all the way up. I recorded the whole thing, she said, handing me her phone. If you need it. Her voice wasn't shaky, it was clear. You don't have to use it, but it's yours. I sent the video to myself, named it October, just like the voicemail. That night, I opened my laptop, clicked the folder, and pressed play. I watched it once. I saw how he grabbed me. I saw how I didn't shrink, how I didn't scream or plead or shake. I just stood there. That mattered. I closed, the video clicked into the court's website and downloaded the forms. Custody, visitation, restraining order. I'd waited a long time for permission from my parents, from my husband, from some invisible figure that said, now it's okay to act. But no one was coming to say it. And that was the point. No one had to. The next morning, I baked early, filled the shop with cardamom and butter and steam. As I shaped the dough, I knew I wasn't just making pastries. I was building a case, a story, a truth that no one else could tell. But now I didn't have to tell it alone. The courthouse smelled like old carpet and anxiety. I sat outside the family courtroom with Dana beside me. Her bag was under her seat, her ID badge clipped to her collar like a quiet shield. I hadn't seen Greg arrive, but I felt him enter the building. It was the way the room changed, like Something thick had seeped into the air. When they called my name, I stood. My knees didn't shake. Not visibly, anyway. Inside, everything hummed. The judge asked for opening remarks. Greg's lawyer launched first, his voice polite, almost warm. Mr. Whitman is concerned about the emotional stability of his wife, who, despite appearances, has exhibited erratic behaviour. She removed the children from their home without prior notice. She relocated across state lines. She is running a business with no experience or formal oversight. We have concerns. I sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't argue. She just nodded toward me. We'd like to let Mrs. Bennet speak directly. I stood. My palms were damp. Your Honour, I said, and my voice didn't crack. I'm not here to blame. I'm here to protect my children. I'd like to submit 2 recordings as evidence. One is an audio recording of a phone call placed to me by Mr. Whitman. The other is a video from a witness taken inside my business. The judge nodded, and the bailiff approached. I sat back down. The courtroom went quiet, except for the sound of Greg's voice laced with fury, calling me a liar, a thief threatening to take back everything. I didn't look at him. When the video played, I heard the bell on my bakery door, the scrape of chairs, and then Greg's voice again. Let's go home, now. The moment where he grabbed my wrist. My voice wasn't loud in the clip, it was steady. This is my home. The judge paused after the video ended. Then Dana stood. She was brief. I was Mrs. Bennet's admitting nurse the night she was brought in with 2 cracked ribs and bruising consistent with a fall. I handed her a card. It was all I could do at the time. Then a second voice came forward. The woman who'd taken the video. She said she came in for coffee 3 times a week and had watched Clara with her kids with customers. That bakery is more stable than my marriage ever was, she said and smiled nervously before returning to her seat. At the end, my lawyer placed a drawing in front of the judge, a child sketch in crayon. The hearth with me standing at the counter and the kids at a small table holding cupcakes. The judge looked at it for a moment longer than I expected. Then she turned to Greg. I find no evidence to support your claim that the mother is unstable. On the contrary, the record demonstrates deliberate, protective, and structured parenting under difficult circumstances. I'm awarding Mrs. Bennet full custody with a protective order in place. Supervised visitation for Mr. Whitman will be arranged at a neutral site. The gavel sounded dull, but final. I exhaled slowly. No cheering, no smile, just breath. When I stepped outside, the sun was brighter than it had been when I walked in. Dana touched my arm gently. You did it. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to feel something settle. My lawyer handed me the folder of paperwork. I didn't look at it. I just held it. That night, we ate dinner at the bakery, me and the kids. Just sandwiches, nothing fancy. Afterward, my daughter gave me a card she made at school. It's not Father's Day, I said softly. It's just You Day, she said. On the front was a drawing of me behind the counter, and above it she'd written, "Thank you for not leaving us in the dark." I didn't cry. I just held it in my hand, ran my thumb over the words. And for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything anymore. I just had to keep going, and I would. One step at a time, one morning at a time, one loaf at a time. A year passed, not quickly. Some days still felt like broken glass, others like warm sun. But time moved, and so did I. The hearth turned one on a Saturday. We didn't throw a party that wasn't our style. I just put a handwritten sign on the door. Thank you for coming home with us this year. By 7:30, the line was out the door. The regulars came first early as always. Beth with her quiet smile and 2 blueberry scones. Mr. Harmon, who never said much but always tipped more than he should. Then came a few new faces, out-of-towners, maybe drawn in by the smell or the sign or the soft clatter of dishes inside. I didn't think much of the woman when she walked in. She was in her 30s maybe. Wore long sleeves despite the warmth kept her head low. She ordered just tea, nothing to eat, and took a seat near the window where the light didn't quite reach. Her hands shook slightly when she picked up the cup. I knew that shake. I remembered it from my own fingers. From hospital blankets, from courtrooms, from doorknobs I couldn't turn. I brought her plate over myself. Just tea and a shortbread cookie, nothing more. I placed it gently in front of her and I didn't say anything. But beneath the saucer I slipped a small card. Cream-coloured. Plain. It read, Clara Bennett, The Hearth You Are Not Alone. She didn't look up, just nodded barely as I stepped away. I didn't watch her open it. I didn't need to. That afternoon, when the rush had quieted and the sunlight hit the wooden floor in long, quiet bands, I sat at the small table in the back, the one I used to reserve for sorting receipts and bills. I pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote a letter. Not to anyone else, just to myself. You don't need them to believe you anymore. You never did. You only needed you. I folded the paper, placed it in an envelope and tucked it inside the register drawer next to the backup keys and the old first aid kit I hadn't touched in months. On the counter sat a small glass jar, the same kind I used to keep sugar packets in. Now it held a stack of those same cream-coloured cards. Not many. Just enough. I restocked them every few weeks. No one asked about them. They just took one if they needed. And sometimes someone would come back later and nod without speaking. That was enough. That was everything. That night, after the shop was closed and the lights dimmed and the kids were asleep upstairs, I stood by the back door for a long time listening. The ocean was louder than usual. Or maybe I just heard it better now. I turned off the last light, locked the door, and left the jar of cards right where it belonged in reach, because someone out there might need it the way I once did. And maybe you're watching this with your own version of long sleeves in warm weather, your own jar hidden at the back of a cupboard, your own silence that no one sees. I just want to say you are not broken. What happened to you does not define you, and there is no shame in wanting safety, no weakness in wanting peace. Across the world, more and more women are learning to name their pain through quiet therapy sessions, support groups, online communities, or simply by opening up to one trusted person. Healing doesn't always look like headlines. Sometimes it looks like a cup of tea that doesn't get cold while you drink it. Sometimes it looks like staying, and sometimes it looks like leaving at 2 a.m. with nothing but your kids and a map in your head. If this story spoke to something inside you, something you've never told anyone, or maybe just never said out loud, know this, you are not alone. And you never were. There's a card waiting for you too, maybe not at the hearth, but somewhere. In a friend's words, in a stranger's kindness, in a video like this. If you found comfort here, I hope you'll stay. Subscribe for more stories, like Clara's, not just about surviving, but about choosing to live. Quietly, fully, on your own terms. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, share it with them. One small thing can make the biggest difference. You matter, you're not too late, and you are not alone.